Hey everyone, welcome back. It's time for another deep dive. And today we're going way back to the Antebellum South. We're talking wet nursing.
Ooh, good thing.
You might think, oh, this is just like a little historical footnote, but it's actually way more complicated. We're looking at this academic article, and it shows how wet nursing wasn't just one thing. It wasn't just enslaved women feeding white babies.
Right, yeah.
There were actually different situations happening, like some women getting paid to do it, and even like informal networks where women helped each other out.
It really makes you realize how much our assumptions about the past can be oversimplified.
Mm.
We think of wet nursing and we tend to picture a very specific scenario.
Right, like a stereotypical image.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the reality is much more nuanced. This article, it's called Mother's Milk, Slavery, Wet Nursing, and Black and White Women in the Antebellum South. And it shows just how diverse these practices actually were in the Antebellum South.
So it wasn't just this one-size-fits-all situation?
No, not at all. And that's one of the things that makes this article so fascinating. It challenges us to think about wet nursing not just as a practice, but as a reflection of the power dynamics and social structures of the time.
That's such a good point. Because it's easy to just think, oh, wet nursing, that's obviously exploitative, especially given the context of slavery. But this article is pushing us to look beyond that initial reaction, right?
Exactly. It's pushing us to look at the nuances, to consider the different ways that wet nursing played out in this very specific historical context.
And you mentioned power dynamics. I mean, it's hard to ignore the power dynamics when we're talking about slavery.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this article doesn't shy away from that. In fact, it directly challenges this romanticized view of wet nursing, this idea that it somehow fostered this special bond between Black and white women.
Oh, yeah, I've heard that before. Like, wet nursing was this way for women to connect across racial lines. But that sounds a little too good to be true, right?
It does. And the article argues that for enslaved mothers, wet nursing was often just another form of exploitation.
Mm.
Their bodies and their ability to nurture were essentially commodified, turned into products that their owners could use to benefit white families.
Wow. So instead of creating this sense of closeness, it actually just reinforced the power imbalance of slavery.
Exactly. It's a really stark reminder of how even the most personal, the most intimate act of mothering could be twisted by the brutalities of that system.
Yeah, that's heavy stuff. And this brings us to another really important figure that we need to talk about, the mammy stereotype.
Ah, yes, the mammy. That image is so pervasive even today. This kind, motherly Black woman caring for white children. But as you might guess, there's a lot more to unpack there.
I bet. It seems like every time we dig into these stereotypical images, we find a much more complicated reality underneath.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the mammy stereotype is no exception.
Hmm.
It's deeply problematic because it erases the truth about the forced labor that these women endured. It completely devalues Black motherhood. And it creates this false narrative of contentment and happiness when the reality was far more brutal.
So it's like we're dealing with these layers of distortion. We've got this romanticized image of wet nursing that the article debunks, and then we've got this mammy stereotype layered on top of that. It seems like we really need to center the actual experiences of the women involved, both Black and white.
Absolutely. And that's what the article does so well. It brings those individual stories to life, especially the stories of enslaved women.
Mhm.
One that really stood out to me was the story of Mary.
Mary.
Yes. The article talks about how her own baby was punished if he cried while she was feeding her master's child.
Oh my gosh. That's just heartbreaking. It really highlights the complete lack of control that these mothers had over their own lives, over their own children.
Exactly. Their choices were extremely limited. If they even had any choice at all, they couldn't decide when, how, or even which baby they were nursing.
And that's a huge contrast to the experiences of white women at the time, right? They could actually choose whether or not to wet nurse. They might face social pressure, but they weren't being forced to give up their own child's nourishment to feed someone else's.
You've hit on a really important point. The power dynamics were fundamentally different.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just about personal choices either. There was a whole economic system tied to wet nursing.
Right. It makes sense. In a system based on exploitation, everything is connected to economics.
Precisely. Slave owners viewed enslaved women's milk as a valuable commodity, something that could benefit their white families, and in a very twisted way, the enslaved infants they owned as well.
So it's like they were trying to have it both ways, exploit enslaved women's labor, but also make sure those babies survived and grew up to be profitable workers.
That's exactly right. And the article gives specific examples of how this played out. Enslaved mothers were often forced to wean their own babies early so they could go back to work, while white women would sometimes wet nurse enslaved infants to keep them healthy and therefore more valuable. It's pretty disturbing.
It is. It really shows how deeply economic concerns were woven into every aspect of these women's lives.
It does. But the article also points out something else that's important. Motherhood wasn't always this strictly individual experience back then. You see, enslaved women sometimes shared breastfeeding responsibilities.
Wait, you mean they would help each other out with breastfeeding?
Yes, and the article highlights how this created a sense of community and support within a system that was incredibly brutal. It also challenges the dominant ideology of the time that emphasized the nuclear family, that very specific white middle-class idea of what a family should look like.
That's powerful. So even in the face of such hardship, these women found ways to connect and support each other. And the article mentions the WPA narratives. Can you remind me what those are?
Sure. The WPA narratives are a collection of first-hand accounts from formerly enslaved people. They were collected in the 1930s as part of a government project.
Right. So the article uses these narratives to get a better understanding of what wet nursing was really like for enslaved women.
Exactly. These narratives offer valuable insights into their lived experiences. They help us see beyond the stereotypes and assumptions that often cloud our understanding of this historical period.
This is already so much more nuanced than I expected. It's amazing what you can learn when you really dig into a topic like this.
Absolutely. And we're just getting started. The article goes on to discuss the sheer number of enslaved women who are involved in wet nursing. It's something that's often overlooked.
You mean there were more women involved than we typically think?
It's difficult to get an exact number, but the article makes a strong case that it was far more common than some previous historians have suggested. We have to remember that even if a relatively small percentage of white women used wet nurses, there were a lot of slave owners in the South. So even that small percentage could represent thousands upon thousands of enslaved women.
Wow. Okay, so the scale of this practice is bigger than we might imagine. That makes those individual stories even more important to hear and understand.
It does. And the article doesn't shy away from the difficult parts of those stories. It talks about the emotional trauma that many enslaved women experienced as a result of being forced into wet nursing.
Yeah, I can only imagine how emotionally devastating it must have been to be separated from your own child and made to nurse another woman's baby.
It was incredibly traumatic.
Yeah.
And to make matters worse, these women often had very limited opportunities for resistance. They were constantly being watched and controlled by their enslavers.
It's heartbreaking to think about what they went through.
It is. And what's really striking is how this sense of injustice comes through in the WPA narratives. There are numerous accounts of formerly enslaved people expressing this deep sense of irony and bitterness. They talk about how they nurtured the very people who were exploiting them, how they literally sustained these white children with their own bodies, only to be met with violence and dehumanization.
That speaks volumes about the deep psychological wounds inflicted by slavery, wounds that went far beyond the physical realm.
Exactly. And it raises some really important questions about how this history shapes our understanding of motherhood and infant feeding today.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, are we really that far removed from those power dynamics and inequalities? I mean, they might look different, but are they still operating in some way?
That's a question worth pondering. And it's something that the article touches on. It points out that even though wet nursing as it existed in the Antebellum South is no longer practiced, the underlying issues of race class and access to resources haven't disappeared.
It's like you said earlier, this isn't just some random fact from the past. It's about how society, how things were set up, actually controlled what women could do with their own bodies. And it makes you wonder, are there ways that's still happening today, even as it looks different?
That's a really insightful observation. It's important to remember that history doesn't just disappear. It echoes through time, shaping the present in ways we might not always realize. And that's especially true when it comes to issues of race, class, and gender.
So we've seen how wet nursing was more than just a simple practice, how it intersected with slavery and power dynamics in really complex ways. But the article also talks about how white women's experiences with wet nursing were different, right?
That's an important point. The article gives examples of white women choosing to use wet nurses because of illness discomfort or simply because they found breastfeeding too demanding. They had the power to delegate that aspect of motherhood, which is something enslaved women couldn't even dream of.
So even though there were social pressures on white women to breastfeed, they still had options that weren't available to enslaved women.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that the article shows how this wasn't always about rejecting motherhood altogether. Sometimes it was about shaping it to fit their own needs and desires. We see this in letters and diaries where white women talk about wanting to maintain their social lives or worrying about the impact of breastfeeding on their bodies.
It's almost like they were trying to find a balance between motherhood and their own personal lives, which is a luxury that enslaved women didn't have.
Precisely. They had a level of control over their reproductive experiences that was unimaginable for enslaved women.
So it wasn't just that white women could choose to wet nurse or not. It was also about the reasons behind those choices. Sometimes they were choosing based on personal preference, but other times it sounds like they were being pressured into it, right?
You're right. The article highlights how, for slaveholders, there was this constant push and pull between wanting to exploit enslaved women's labor and wanting to ensure the survival of their valuable human property. And wet nursing played a really interesting role in navigating that tension.
Okay, I see what you mean. On one hand, they wanted to get enslaved mothers back to work as quickly as possible after childbirth, but on the other hand, they needed those infants to survive and grow up to be profitable laborers. It's a tough thing to wrap your head around.
It is. And that's where the milk of white mistresses could become really valuable. It allowed slaveholders to separate enslaved mothers from their infants and send them back to work while still making sure those infants were being fed.
It's a really stark example of how, under slavery, even the most basic human act of feeding a baby was twisted by economics and power.
It really is. But the article also complicates this picture a bit. It pushes back against the idea that wet nursing was always about fostering closeness or affection between black and white women.
So you're saying it wasn't always this warm and fuzzy relationship?
Exactly. The article shows how it could also be a source of conflict and resentment, especially for enslaved women. They weren't just providing a service, they were being forced to sacrifice their own children's well-being to serve the needs of their enslavers.
I can see how that would breed resentment. It's just another layer of the trauma that these women endured.
Right. And for white women, those relationships could also be fraught with tension. They might have felt a sense of dependence on the enslaved women who were nursing their children, but that dependence existed alongside a deep fear of those women and a need to assert their dominance.
It's like they were constantly trying to reconcile their need for these women with their fear of them.
Exactly. Yeah. And the article gives examples of white women expressing anxiety about enslaved women's influence over their children, worrying that those children might become too attached to their wet nurses or adopt their ways. It's a really complex dynamic.
So even while relying on these women for such an intimate service, they were still trying to maintain a sense of distance and control.
Right. And that brings us back to the point we made earlier about the mammy stereotype. That stereotype served to neutralize the threat that white women perceived from enslaved wet nurses. It cast them as docile, loyal figures who posed no danger to the white family.
So it was a way of reassuring white women that they were still in control, even though they were relying on these black women for something so essential.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that that stereotype persisted long after slavery ended. It continued to shape how black women were perceived and treated, particularly in the context of domestic work and childcare.
It's a reminder that the legacies of slavery are still very much with us today.
Absolutely. And I think this deep dive into the history of wet nursing helps us see those legacies more clearly. It's not just about understanding the past. It's about recognizing how the past continues to shape the present.
That's such a powerful point. And speaking of the present, the article also makes a connection between historical wet nursing practices and contemporary conversations about milk sharing. It's a pretty big leap, right? I mean, how can we compare something that happened centuries ago to something that's happening today?
It's a good question. And while the article acknowledges the vast differences between the two, it argues that there are some interesting parallels worth exploring. For example, both wet nursing and modern milk sharing involve women sharing breast milk across social and economic lines.
So even though the circumstances are completely different, there's still this idea of women helping each other out with infant feeding.
Yes, and that's where things get interesting. The article prompts us to consider how power dynamics and social inequalities might still be at play in modern milk sharing, even if they're not as overt or as brutal as they were under slavery.
So you're saying that even though we've moved beyond a system of forced labor, there might still be subtle ways in which race and class influence who has access to donor milk and who benefits from those arrangements.
Precisely. And the article encourages us to be mindful of those dynamics, to think critically about the motivations and the potential consequences of milk sharing practices today.
That's a really important point. It's like you're saying we need to be aware of the history even as we're navigating these contemporary issues.
Exactly. And that's what makes this deep dive so valuable. It's not just about learning some interesting facts about the past. It's about using those facts to understand the present and to ask better questions about the future.
This has been an incredible deep dive so far. It's been challenging, but it's also been really eye-opening.
I agree. And I think it's just the beginning of a much larger conversation about the complexities of motherhood, the legacies of slavery, and the ways in which our personal choices are always intertwined with larger social forces.
Absolutely. And we encourage you to continue exploring this topic, to seek out diverse voices and perspectives, and to consider the ways in which our collective past continues to influence the choices women make about their bodies and their families. It's amazing how one article can open up so many different layers of a topic. We've talked about the exploitation, the economics, even this really disturbing mammy stereotype. But what stands out to you as the most surprising insight so far?
Hmm, that's a good question. I think what struck me the most is how the article reframes wet nursing. It's not just a practice. It's like a point of intersection for all these different forces. Race, gender economics, even ideas about what it means to be a mother. It's not just the simple transaction. It's a window into the complexities of power and relationships in the antebellum South.
I like that. A window into the complexities. And it makes me think about the article's discussion of white women who chose to wet nurse enslaved infants. It wasn't always a simple matter of preference for them either, right?
You're right. The article shows how those decisions were often influenced by a web of social and economic pressures. We have to remember that slave owners had a vested interest in the health and survival of their enslaved infants.
Right, because those infants represented future labor and profit.
Exactly. So even though white women might have had more choices than enslaved women, their choices were still constrained by the system of slavery.
It all comes back to power in the end. Who had it, who didn't, and how it played out in the most intimate aspects of these women's lives.
Power is definitely a central theme here, and it makes you think about the relationships between the women involved. We've talked about the mammy stereotype and how it distorts the reality of those relationships. But what did those relationships actually look like on a day-to-day basis?
That's what I'm wondering. What was the reality beyond the stereotype?
Well, the article really pushes back against the idea that wet nursing was always about creating this bond of affection or closeness between black and white women.
Yeah.
It was much more complicated than that.
So it wasn't always this heartwarming cross-racial connection.
It might have been in some cases. But we have to remember that these relationships existed within a system of profound inequality and exploitation. The article emphasizes that enslaved women didn't enter into these relationships freely. They were forced into them.
And that lack of agency must have had a huge impact on how those relationships played out.
Absolutely. It created this fundamental power imbalance that permeated every aspect of their interactions. Even in these situations where a white woman might have felt some genuine affection for the enslaved woman nursing her child, that affection was always filtered through the lens of ownership and control.
So it wasn't a relationship between equals, even if there were moments of kindness or connection.
Exactly, and the article highlights how this dynamic could lead to really complicated emotions on both sides. For enslaved women, there might have been feelings of resentment, anger, even a sense of betrayal. Imagine being forced to nurture the child of the person who was exploiting you and your family.
It's just another layer of the trauma that these women endured.
It is. And for white women, those relationships could also be fraught with tension. They might have felt a sense of dependence on the enslaved women who were nursing their children. But that dependence existed alongside a deep fear of those women and a need to assert their dominance. It's a very complex dynamic.
It's like they were constantly trying to reconcile their need for these women with their fear of them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the article gives examples of white women expressing anxiety about enslaved women's influence over their children, worrying that those children might become too attached to their wet nurses or adopt their ways.
Wow. So even while relying on these women for such an intimate service, they were still trying to maintain a sense of distance and control.
Right, and that brings us back to the mammy stereotype we talked about earlier. That stereotype served to neutralize the threat that white women perceived from enslaved wet nurses. It cast them as docile, loyal figures who posed no danger to the white family.
Oh, I see. So it was a way of reassuring white women that they were still in control, even though they were relying on these black women for something so essential.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that that stereotype persisted long after slavery ended. It continued to shape how black women were perceived and treated, particularly in the context of domestic work and childcare.
It's a reminder that the legacies of slavery are still very much with us today, even in the ways we think about and portray certain groups of people.
You're absolutely right. And I think this deep dive into the history of wet nursing helps us see those legacies more clearly. It's not just about understanding the past, it's about recognizing how the past continues to shape the present.
It definitely makes you think about how the past is never really past. It's always there, influencing the present in ways we might not even realize. And speaking of the present, the article also makes a connection between historical wet nursing practices and contemporary conversations about milk sharing. It's a pretty big leap, right? I mean, how can we compare something that happened centuries ago to something that's happening today?
It is a big leap. And while the article acknowledges the vast differences between the two, It argues that there are some interesting parallels worth exploring. For example, both wet nursing and modern milk sharing involve women sharing breast milk across social and economic lines.
Okay, so even though the circumstances are completely different, there's still this idea of women helping each other out with infant feeding.
Yes, and that's where things get interesting. The article prompts us to consider how power dynamics and social inequalities might still be at play in modern milk sharing, even if they're not as overt or as brutal as they were under slavery.
I see what you mean. So you're saying that even though we've moved beyond a system of forced labor, there might still be subtle ways in which race and class influence who has access to donor milk and who benefits from those arrangements.
Precisely. And the article encourages us to be mindful of those dynamics, to think critically about the motivations and the potential consequences of milk sharing practices today.
That's a really important point. It's like you're saying we need to be aware of the history even as we're navigating these contemporary issues.
Exactly. And that's what makes this deep dive so valuable.
Hmm.
It's not just about learning some interesting facts about the past. It's about using those facts to understand the present and to ask better questions about the future.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've seen how wet nursing was used as a tool of exploitation under slavery,
Okay.
how it shaped relationships between black and white women, and how those historical practices continue to resonate in modern debates about infant feeding. But the article also touches on something that's a little bit different. It talks about how, as artificial feeding methods improved, wet nursing started to decline. What was the impact of that shift?
That's a great question. And it takes us into some really interesting territory. The decline of wet nursing marked a major turning point in the history of infant feeding, particularly for women in the Western world.
Mm.
As artificial feeding methods like formula became more widely available and acceptable, women, especially white middle-class women, gained a new level of control over their reproductive experiences.
So they had more options, more choices about how they wanted to feed their babies.
Exactly. They were no longer reliant on either enslaved women or hired wet nurses to feed their infants. This was a huge shift. It meant that they could, in theory, choose to breastfeed or not based on their own preferences and circumstances.
That sounds pretty empowering, but I'm guessing it wasn't that simple for everyone.
You're right. While this shift offered new possibilities for some women, it also came with its own set of complexities and challenges. For black women, the decline of wet nursing represented a move away from a form of labor that had often been forced upon them under slavery. But it also meant a potential shift in their economic roles.
So it wasn't a straightforward victory for black women?
No, it wasn't. While they were no longer being exploited through wet nursing, they often faced new forms of economic marginalization and discrimination in other areas of domestic work.
So it was a mixed bag, like with
Us.
so many things in history.
Exactly. And it's important to note that the decline of wet nursing didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process, and it varied from place to place. The article points out that wet nursing continued to be practiced in some parts of the South well into the 20th century, particularly among black families who had limited access to other options.
It's like every step forward brought its own set of challenges and inequalities. And the article mentions how even the term wet nursing has become so loaded with negative connotations that some advocates for milk sharing today have tried to rename it cross-feeding.
It's true. And it's a really interesting example of how language can reflect these deep-seated anxieties and judgments around women sharing breast milk, particularly across racial or class lines.
It's like the history is still there lurking beneath the surface,
Yeah.
even in the words we use.
Exactly. And I think this deep dive has done a great job of uncovering that history and helping us understand its complexities. It's not about passing judgment or pointing fingers. It's about recognizing the enduring power of the past to shape our present and our future.
Well said. And I think that's a perfect note to end on for this part of our deep dive. We've delved into the history of wet nursing, explored its connections to slavery and power dynamics, and even touched on its relevance to modern conversations about infant feeding. But there's still more to unpack, right?
Absolutely. We've barely scratched the surface of the article's insights. There's so much more to discuss about the emotional experiences of the women involved, the ethical dilemmas surrounding wet nursing, and the broader social implications of this fascinating and often troubling practice.
Okay, then let's dive back in. We've got more to uncover, more to think about, and more to learn from this journey through history. As we get into this last part of our deep dive, I keep thinking about how the article really doesn't shy away from the tough stuff about wet nursing. We talk about exploitation and these power imbalances, but there's something else there, like all these really intense emotions under the surface.
Oh yeah, the emotional impact of wet nursing on both the enslaved women and the white women.
Hmm.
It's powerful. We focus on the physical act of breastfeeding, but The emotional bonds that form during that time. That's something we don't always consider.
And here, those bonds, they were so messed up by slavery and all the racisms. Like, all these women trying to deal with this whole mix of emotions, love and resentment,
Yeah.
fear, obligation.
It's a lot. And the article brings those emotions to life by telling personal stories. You hear about enslaved mothers grieving because they can't feed their own babies, and white mothers worried that their infants are getting too attached to the wet nurses and the enslaved women. They had such conflicted feelings about taking care of these children, children of the very people oppressing them.
It makes it so real. You know, this wasn't just something that happened in history books. It was about real lives and relationships and feelings.
And feelings that could change depending on the specific situation.
Yeah.
The article is really good at showing that it wasn't always a clear-cut good or bad, love or hate.
More nuanced than that.
Right. And it really makes us think about all those different sides, to not simplify these historical relationships too much.
We have to remember both things at once, that there could be genuine affection there, but also the reality of exploitation. Those two things existed together.
Exactly. And the article also talks about the ethical dilemmas of wet nursing for the women involved and for the whole society at that time.
Seems like there were ethical problems everywhere you looked.
Everywhere. Think about it. For enslaved women, just the act of breastfeeding another woman's child, that could be seen as resistance, as if they were saying, we are human, we have maternal bonds, even though the system was trying to take that away from them.
But they were forced to do it. No choice.
Right. Their bodies used like tools, even in something as intimate as breastfeeding. And for white women, they face ethical challenges too.
You mean using enslaved women to feed their own children?
Exactly.
Yeah.
The article shows how some white women, they knew it was wrong, they felt uncomfortable with it, but they needed the help, and they often told themselves that wet nursing was the best thing for their babies.
Such a complicated situation, even for the people who understood that slavery was wrong.
Morally complex. And the article, it doesn't try to give simple answers or judge people. It just makes us think about how difficult it was. How did individuals deal with these moral questions in a system that was so unjust?
A lot to think about, especially when we see how these ethical questions are still relevant today. The article talks about how people share breast milk now, and we still have those same questions. Consent compensation, the potential for exploitation, even though the world is so different.
It's true. And that's why this history of wet nursing is so helpful. It reminds us that even when we try to do something good, even something personal, there might be power dynamics and economic factors involved, things we need to watch out for.
So we can't just look at individual choices. We have to see the bigger picture.
You got it. And I think this whole deep dive has been a journey through a difficult and often painful part of history, but also a journey where we learn so much. It reminds us that history, it's not just dates and facts. It's about us. It's how we became who we are. And it's a call to action, to really look at the world around us and try to create a future where all mothers and all children are treated with dignity and respect.
Thanks for going on this deep dive with us into this fascinating and often troubling world of wet nursing in the Antebellum South. We hope you keep learning about this topic. Find different voices and perspectives, and think about how our past keeps influencing the choices women make about their bodies and their families. Until next time.